Hello, and welcome to our series on children's Bible storybooks. Today we are going to be looking at the Preschoolers Bible by V. Gilbert Beers, illustrated by Tammy Leon. I'll put a link in the description where you can look at or purchase the book, and if you missed my previous videos on the topic and want to know more, you can start here or check the description for links. Like the previous book we examined, this seems to be a new 2012 edition of an older 1994 book. I haven't had a chance to look at the older version, so aside from the illustrations, I'm not sure if significant changes were made. Some of our reviews will likely apply to both. This book was also created to follow the Toddler's Bible by the same author. This is the second book we're reviewing, and I have a couple of reasons for choosing this to look at second. First, in some ways, it's very similar to the first book we looked at, The New Bible in Pictures for Little Eyes by Kenneth N. Taylor, which should make comparisons easier. Like that book, this one is also aimed at preschoolers, which makes it a little shorter to read while still containing a significant amount of stories. Second, the author, Victor Gilbert Beers, was quite prolific, over 100 books just for children. I grew up with the Muffin Family storybooks myself, and as I've been working on this series, I keep coming across more works by him. I don't have exact data, but my guess is that between Taylor and Beers, we're covering a significant portion of the Bible stories that children would have been familiar with from the 60s to the early 2000s. Because of that, it's also likely that his work impacted some of the other authors we will consider later. So this seems like it will help form a decent baseline for our exploration. This book features colorful, kid-friendly images, neither too graphic nor especially cheesy. The stories are short and use language that is simple enough for preschoolers to understand and for young readers to start to be able to read on their own. Over 100 stories from the Bible are told. There is a little more emphasis on the Pentateuch and the Gospels, but stories from other parts are also included. A few more unusual stories are included, such as Isaac digging wells and the resurrection of Dorcas. To compare it with Taylor's book, the stories are slightly longer. Each story is roughly 2 paragraphs instead of 1, and most of them have two-page spreads, making for 2 large pictures rather than 1 smaller one. Because of this, there are not as many stories, though the ones included have slightly more details. The main stories that didn't make the cut are ones from Numbers, Deuteronomy, and stories from the Kingdom era. There were a few things that I found disconcerting, and most of my thoughts were echoed by other reviewers online. First, the author wrote in the present tense. It was a bit jarring to read God makes everything as part of the creation story rather than God made everything. Second, while it does avoid showing all the characters as white people, they don't necessarily seem to be Semitic or Egyptian or African or any specific ethnicity. Almost everyone in the book has roughly the same dark skin, the same straight dark hair, and the same nose. There are a couple of places where there is variation. Esau is given red hair to match his name, for example, but that's almost the only thing. In general, the pictures were generic and simple enough to not be terribly inaccurate in their details, but there were a couple places where it bothered me. One of the worst was the nativity scene. It was very recognizably stereotypical. I've seen ornaments with a similar design, but also therefore very inaccurate. The stable wasn't open air. It wasn't outside of Bethlehem, and Bethlehem isn't especially known for its abundance of palm trees. I think I was more nitpicky with the last book we considered, but that doesn't necessarily mean this one is better, just less detailed. Like many books, it is often too green, though sometimes also too barren. People seem to forget that deserts have plants other than palm trees. In addition, one story goes from very green to very barren with no apparent reason. Lastly, I would argue that the author was more often writing theology than communicating the story. The phrase, so and so obeyed God, or some variation, was repeated so often it was a bit distracting. The idea seemed to be that the children don't need to fully understand what happened in the story. They just need to know that the people who obeyed God were happy and the ones who didn't were sad. This may be what some people want, but I would prefer a book that tells the story better and then leaves room for parent and child to discuss and think about how that could apply personally. Overall, if you are looking for a book that serves as a brief introduction to character and stories in the Bible, and you are unlikely to be bothered by present tense repetitive language that leans heavily into moralistic, watered down theology, this might work for you. With only one other book on our tier list, this seems like it should be easy, but it is not. There are definitely things it does better. More women's stories and less threatening of violence. And things it does worse. Not as many stories and distracting language. Both of them are pretty focused on the moral of the story rather than the story itself. I keep changing my mind as to whether I like one more than the other. So it seems a bit of a cop-out, but I think I'll put them at the same tier. If this keeps happening, we may just forgo the list. If that summary is enough information for you, feel free to stop here. I will put links in the description to a document with a fully filled out rubric and other notes I made while looking at this book. But if you want to hear more of my thoughts or see some more specific examples, keep watching and we will work our way through the rubric and give more details. This book was illustrated by Tammy Leon. She's illustrated dozens of different books, including the Katie Wu and the Pedro book series. Earlier, I criticized the lack of diversity in the book, but I do want to point out that Leon's other work shows a decent amount of diversity. I'm not sure who is to blame for everyone looking about the same in this book, but it's not a lack of ability on her part. On this, I would guess that she used some combination of watercolor, colored pencils, and markers for these illustrations. I would categorize it as kid style, pretty much the sort of illustrations you would expect with a children's story. They are attractive and generally serve to illustrate the story, but aren't especially remarkable. We already mentioned that skin and hair seem too monochrome to be either representative or accurate. And the same could be said for much of the background details. The clothing tends to be fairly generic Bible bathrobe, with a few exceptions, such as where Egyptians are pictured. The pictures are fairly simple, which means few background details to critique. I do like the image of the tabernacle on page 120. The tabernacle seems fairly accurate, and the desert around it is believable. Other architectural details can be a little inconsistent. Sometimes arched windows are pictured where it would be more likely for them to be square, for example. As another example of anachronism, this chest, supposedly for collecting funds during the time of Joash, looks much more like a second temple ossuary. Right area, wrong time and purpose. A specific flora and fauna are not given much details, but palm trees were again common in areas where I'd expect tamarask trees or oleander or other similar smaller bushes. I would compare the newer pictures to the ones in the older version, but right now I can only guess based off the covers that the newer ones are more detailed and realistic than the older ones. Gilbert Beers was born in Illinois in 1928 and died in April of 2024. His obituary mentions that he grew up quite poor. Apparently, when his family's home burned down, they spent 2 years living in an insulated boxcar. For any of my family watching, this will sound familiar. Of course, for my own grandfather, born around the same time, adding on a boxcar to his family's existing tiny structure was a step up rather than down. Beers attended Wheaton as an undergraduate and then went on to get 5 more degrees at various other schools, including a THD and a PhD. He wrote over 200 books. He worked at David C. Cook Publishing, and he was senior editor at Christianity Today. I mention all this to give us some sense of his theological background, as well as the impact he has had on the Christian world, especially in the US, but also abroad. At some point, it will probably be worth looking at more of the children's Bible storybooks he authored and comparing and contrasting them. As this one is aimed at fairly young children, he did make choices to really simplify the stories and the language in ways that his other books didn't. The stated goal in the introduction of this book is to help children learn to delight in the Bible. While different children will have different reactions, I'm not sure it achieves that goal in general. Now that I've read through the book, there seems to be a fairly simple theology being pushed. God is good and takes care of us. We need to listen to God and obey Him, then we can go to heaven. I say it's being pushed because the stories tend to ignore anything complicated and sometimes speak in anachronistic ways. It feels a little like propaganda for children. Learn to be kind and obey. That's what Jesus wants. This book contains 8 women's names in the titles, which is 2 more than the Little Eyes book, but still inadequate. Esther's story is included, but she is not named in the title. I do think it's noteworthy that the resurrection of Dorcas or Tabitha is included. I've only seen her story included in 2 other Bible storybooks so far, and one of them was also by Beers. However, I am a little concerned that her story was only included as an example of a good woman who cleans and cooks and sews. I also find it concerning that complicated stories are mostly avoided or glossed over. For example, 3 stories from David's life are told, only the ones that show him as brave and kind. The fight with Goliath, his friendship with Jonathan, and his kindness to Mephibosheth. However, if you are concerned about what kinds of stories you are telling to your preschooler, this is a fairly safe option. The last thing that bothered me is what I'm going to call anachronistic theology, by which I mean the tendency to teach a much later interpretation of a passage rather than the passage itself. For example, the story of Nicodemus coming to Jesus in John 3 is told, and in this book it concludes with the statement, quote, Nicodemus learns something important about going to heaven. Almost certainly he did not. The concept of going to heaven was a much later development. Nicodemus learned important things about the kingdom of God, but that is not the same thing. This was just another way that the author tended to oversimplify and warp stories to teach specific lessons. First, in terms of accessibility, there is an audiobook available on Audible. Also of note on this topic, since the pictures cover the whole page, text is always on top of the pictures, and with some of the pictures that can make the text hard to read. It's not a problem on all of the pages, but enough that it could be a concern. In terms of other practical considerations, the stories are consistent lengths that could work for devotions or bedtime. Many of them include questions, though the questions are often rhetorical, don't you think that was a good thing type of questions. Some reviewers found that these questions help draw children in. Sometimes there are prompts to pray, like, do you think Job thanked God? Would you? Reviewers were divided on what they liked and disliked. Some really liked the emphasis on obedience and the clear applications, while others found the stories watered down and the theology weak. In many ways, this book was very similar to the last one we looked at, Taylor's Little Eyes book. There are differences, but I think it's significant that the things I disliked in both of them were the same. The same types of inaccuracies in the pictures and the same types of moralistic leanings in the text. I am afraid that these failings are common in Bible storybooks, though there are some more recent ones that have worked hard to avoid some of these problems. To avoid getting into a rut, we'll plan to consider something significantly different next time. Thank you for watching. Have a lovely day and pay attention to your context.